The scream came from the throne room before dawn, and every guard in the castle froze at the sound of it. Mira heard it from the herb store 2 floors below, where she had been grinding dried root into powder for a fever tonic. The bowl slipped from her hands and cracked on the stone floor. She did not move to pick it up. She had heard that scream before, weeks ago, carried down through the walls like something trapped that wanted out, and she remembered what happened to the man who went to answer it. He never came back down. Footsteps thundered above her. She counted them without meaning to, the way she counted heartbeats when a patient's breathing turns shallow. 6 men, maybe 7, moving fast. Then a voice she did not know shouted her name through the corridor, cracking with something close to fear. Healer. The king demands the healer, now. She had been in this castle for 11 days. She had healed a stable boy's broken wrist and a cook's burned hand and an old guard's failing knees. Small and quiet work that kept her out of sight of the upper halls. She had done everything she could to remain unseen, because the servants whispered that the last 3 healers summoned to the king's private chamber had left the castle within a day, pale and silent, refusing ever to speak of what they saw. One of them, an old woman named Bettina who had treated kings and farmers alike for 40 years, had packed her bags in the middle of the night and walked 12 miles to the nearest village, rather than spend 1 more hour inside these walls. Mira had asked her once, quietly, what had frightened her so badly. Bettina had only shaken her head and said, "Some wounds are not meant to be looked at, child. Some are meant to be left alone in the dark where they live." Now the guard was at the door of the herb store, breathing hard, his hand already reaching for her arm. "Now," he said again. "Not tomorrow. Not in an hour. Now." She did not resist. There was no resisting a summons from the Alpha King. She wiped the powder from her hands onto her apron, gathered her satchel of tools with fingers that did not shake nearly as much as she expected them to, and followed him up the stone stairs 2 at a time. The upper halls of the castle were different from the lower ones. Down below, the stone was worn smooth by centuries of feet, warm with torchlight and the smell of bread and wood smoke. Up here, the corridors were narrower, colder, lit by fewer torches spaced further apart, as though the king himself preferred the shadows to press in close around him. The guards who lined these halls did not speak. They did not look at her either. Their eyes stayed fixed straight ahead, the way soldiers look when they have learned that seeing too much brings its own punishment. At the end of the last corridor stood 2 enormous doors, black wood banded in iron, and behind them she could hear something that made her stomach drop. A low growl, not quite human, not quite animal, something in between, something that came from deep in a chest that could barely contain it. The guard who had summoned her stopped 3 paces from the door and would not go closer. "He is in there," the guard said, and his voice had gone very quiet. "The royal physician left an hour ago. He said he would not go back inside, not for gold, not for his own life. You are the only healer left in the castle who has not yet refused him." "Why does he need a healer at all?" Mira asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "What is wrong with him?" The guard's eyes flicked to the door and back to her, and something passed over his face that looked almost like pity. "The scar," he said. "It has opened again." Before she could ask what that meant, the doors were pulled open from the inside, and she was looking, for the first time, at the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. He stood in the center of a chamber lit only by the fire and a great stone hearth, and even in the dim orange light she could see that he was enormous, taller than any man she had treated before, built like something meant for war rather than court. He wore no shirt. Across his chest and up along the left side of his jaw ran a scar unlike anything she had ever seen, a jagged line of ruined flesh that looked both old and somehow fresh at once, as though the wound had healed 1,000 times and torn open 1,000 times more. Blood, dark and slow, was seeping from it now. He was breathing hard, his hands braced against the stone mantel of the fireplace, his head down, his whole body coiled tight like a rope pulled to its breaking point. When the doors opened, he did not turn around. "Get out," he said. His voice was low and rough, scraped raw. "Whoever you are, get out before I make you regret walking in." The guard behind Mira took an immediate step backward into the corridor. She understood, in that moment, exactly why the last 3 healers had fled this room, and never spoken of it again. But she had learned something in her years of healing that most people never learned, something her mother had taught her before she died. Pain does not frighten the wounded as much as it frightens the people who have to watch it. And a man in this much pain, however dangerous, however powerful, was still simply a man who needed help. She stepped further into the room instead of leaving it. "I was told you needed a healer," she said. "I am a healer. I would like to look at the wound." He went very still. For a long moment, the only sound in the chamber was the crackle of the fire and his own uneven breathing. Then, slowly, he turned his head just enough to look at her over his shoulder, and she saw his eyes for the first time. They were a pale gold color, almost amber, and they held something in them that she had not expected. Not rage, not the cold cruelty the servants whispered about in the kitchens after dark. What she saw, for just a fraction of a second before he masked it, was exhaustion so deep it looked like it had been carried for years. "You do not know what you are asking to look at," he said quietly. "I have looked at a great many wounds," she answered. "I have never yet found one that frightened me more than watching a person suffer, because no one would look at all." Something shifted in his expression, so briefly she almost missed it. Then his jaw tightened, and the mask came back down, and he straightened to his full height, turning fully toward her so that the firelight caught the whole terrible length of the scar running from his jaw to his collarbone. "Then look," he said, "and see if you still want to stay once you have." She crossed the room toward him, her satchel gripped tight in one hand, aware of every step, aware of the way the guards outside the door had gone utterly silent, as though holding their breath for her. She had treated soldiers with wounds that should have killed them. She had treated children burned in house fires and old men crushed under falling timber. She told herself this would be no different. It was different the moment she was close enough to truly see it. The scar was not a single wound. It was many, layered over each other, as though the same line had been cut again and again across years. Each time along the exact same path. Some parts of it had healed smooth and pale, others were raw, freshly split, weeping slow lines of blood down over muscle that trembled faintly under her gaze. Not from pain, she realized, but from the effort of holding himself still. "How long has it been bleeding?" she asked, keeping her voice level, professional, the voice she used for every patient no matter how frightened they were. "Since before dawn," he said. "And how long has it looked like this? Layered like this, healing and reopening?" His golden eyes found hers, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Longer than you would believe," he said finally. "Are you going to treat it, or are you going to ask questions until the sun rises?" She did not answer with words. She set her satchel on the small table near the hearth and began laying out her tools, clean cloth, the salve she had made that very morning, needle and thread should the wound require closing. Her hands, she was relieved to find, were perfectly steady. "This will hurt," she said. "I will not lie to you about that." "I have had far worse than a needle," he said, and there was the faintest, driest note of something almost like humor in his voice, gone as quickly as it appeared. She began her work in silence, cleaning the wound first, watching him carefully for any sign that he might lash out the way the servants whispered he had done before. But he did not move except to breathe, slow and controlled, his hands braced white-knuckled against the stone mantel, his eyes fixed on some point on the far wall as though he were somewhere else entirely. It was strange, she thought, how a man capable of terrifying an entire castle could stand so perfectly still under her hands, like he had trained himself long ago never to flinch no matter what was done to him. She worked for nearly an hour, cleaning, stitching where the wound had torn deepest, applying the salve in slow, careful strokes. Twice her fingers brushed against skin that was not scarred, ordinary and warm, and both times she felt him tense beneath her touch as though her gentleness surprised him more than any blade could have. When she finally finished and stepped back to examine her work, the fire had burned low, and the first gray light of morning was beginning to creep in through the narrow window high above them. "It is done, for now," she said. "It will need to be checked again tomorrow, and the day after. Wounds like this, layered the way this one is, do not heal quickly." He straightened slowly, testing the stitches with careful movement, and turned to look at her properly for the first time since she had begun. "You did not run," he said. It was not quite a question. "Should I have?" "Every healer before you did." "I am not every healer," she said simply, gathering her tools back into her satchel. He watched her with an expression she could not quite read, something caught between suspicion and a curiosity he did not seem to want to feel. When she turned to leave, his voice stopped her at the door. "What is your name?" She paused, her hand on the cold iron of the door frame. "Mira," she said. "Mira," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it. "You will come back tomorrow, at the same hour." It was not a request, and she understood that. But something in the way he said it, low and almost hesitant, made it feel less like a command from a king, and more like a man who was afraid, in some quiet corner of himself, that she might not. "I will come back," she said. She left the chamber with her satchel in hand and her heart beating harder than it had all night. Not from fear of him, she realized as she made her way back down through the cold corridors, but from the strange, unshakable feeling that she had just seen something no one else in this castle had been allowed to see in a very long time. Behind her, in the dim orange light of the dying fire, the Alpha King stood alone, with his hand pressed briefly against the fresh stitches on his chest, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the ache there felt almost bearable. Word spread through the castle by midday the way it always did, quiet and quick, passed between servants in the kitchens and stable hands mucking out stalls, carried on breath that dropped to a whisper the moment anyone official came near. The new healer had gone into the king's chamber. The new healer had come back out again, alive, unshaken, and had been summoned to return. No one quite knew what to make of it. Mira heard the whispers everywhere she went that day, though no one spoke directly to her about it. The cook gave her an extra portion of bread at the midday meal without being asked. The stable boy she had treated days before offered to carry her water bucket, glancing at her sideways with something like awe. Even the guards who had barely acknowledged her presence before now nodded to her in the halls, quick and uncertain, as though unsure whether she deserved respect or pity. She did not feel deserving of either. She felt only the lingering weight of what she had seen in that chamber, the layered ruin of a wound that should never have looked the way it did, healing and tearing and healing again across what must have been years. She had treated hundreds of injuries in her life. She had never seen anything like it. That evening, alone in the small room she had been given near the healer's quarters, she sat by the single candle and tried to make sense of what she had witnessed. The wound's pattern was wrong for any weapon she knew. It was too precise to be an accident, too repeated to be a single injury that simply refused to heal cleanly. It looked, if she allowed herself to think it, like something that returned again and again on its own, as though bound to some cause far deeper than any blade. She thought of Bettina's words. Some wounds are not meant to be looked at. She thought, too, of the king's eyes in that firelit room, the exhaustion buried under all that danger, the way his voice had gone quiet and almost uncertain when he asked her name. Whatever secret that wound was hiding, she understood now that she had already stepped too far inside it to walk away. The next evening, when the same guard came to fetch her at the same hour, she was already waiting with her satchel packed, and this time, when she walked the long, cold corridor toward the black iron doors, her steps did not falter at all. The second night began with a question no one had dared to ask before. "How long have you been king?" Mira asked, unwrapping fresh cloth from her satchel while the fire in the great hearth cracked and spat behind her. Draven did not answer right away. He sat this time instead of standing, lowering himself onto a low wooden bench near the fire, his shirt already removed and set aside as though he had learned, in a single night, that resistance to her work was pointless. The stitches from the evening before had held, though the skin around them was still raw and swollen, and a thin line of fresh blood had begun to seep from one corner where the old wound insisted on reopening despite everything she had done. 6 years, he said finally, since I was 22. That is young to carry a crown. It is young to carry many things, he said, and something in his tone told her not to press further, not yet. She knelt in front of him and began her work in silence, cleaning the wound with careful, practiced movements, watching his face for any flicker of reaction. He held himself the same way he had the night before, rigid and controlled, his jaw set, his eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder. But she noticed something new tonight, something she had missed in the shadows and urgency of their first meeting. His hands, resting on his knees, were not still. His fingers pressed into the fabric of his trousers every few seconds, releasing and pressing again, a small, contained motion that looked almost like a man counting silently to himself to get through something unbearable. "You do this every night?" she asked. "Sit here and let it bleed until someone comes?" "I do not let anyone come," he said. "You are the first in a long while who has not been ordered away by morning. Why did the others leave?" His eyes flicked to hers then, sharp and searching, as though trying to determine whether she truly did not know or was simply testing him. "They saw what I am," he said quietly, "and they did not want to look again." She did not ask him what he meant by that. She had learned long ago that patients revealed their deepest truths, not when pressed, but when given room enough to arrive at them on their own. So instead she finished cleaning the wound, applied fresh salve, and began stitching the reopened section with slow, even movements, the needle catching torchlight each time it passed through skin. He did not flinch. He never flinched. But halfway through the stitching, his breathing changed, growing shallow and quick, and his hand, without seeming to notice it was doing so, came up and gripped the edge of the bench hard enough that his knuckles turned pale. "You are somewhere else," she said, not looking up from her work. "Where do you go when you do that?" The question startled him. She felt it in the sudden stillness of his body, the way his breathing caught entirely for a moment before resuming, slower this time, more controlled. "You ask too many questions for a healer," he said. "I ask exactly as many as I need to understand what I am treating," she answered. "A wound like this does not come from nowhere, and it does not return again and again without reason. If I am to help you, I need to know what I am fighting, not just where it bleeds." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she finished the stitching and began wrapping fresh cloth around his chest, her fingers brushing warm skin that flinched, ever so slightly, this time not from pain but from something else entirely, something that made her pause and glance up at him despite herself. His golden eyes were fixed on her, and there was a rawness in them she had not seen the night before, something unguarded that he seemed to realize a moment too late he had let show. "You cannot fight this," he said. "No one can. It is not a wound in the way you understand wounds. It is a mark, a price. It does not care for salves or stitches or healers with steady hands, however skilled. Then what does it care for?" He looked away from her, back toward the fire, and for a long moment she thought he would not answer at all. "Guilt," he said finally, so quietly she almost missed it. "It cares for guilt." The word settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples she could feel but not yet see the shape of. She did not push further. She simply finished wrapping the bandage, gathered her tools, and rose to her feet, aware that she had been given something precious tonight, a single true word offered freely, and that demanding more of him now would only make him regret giving it at all. "Rest tonight if you can," she said. "The stitches will hold better if you are still." "I do not sleep well," he said, and there was something almost like an apology in it, though kings, she was quickly learning, did not apologize easily, even for small things. "Then rest without sleeping," she said. "Sometimes that is enough." She left him there in the firelight, and as she made her way back through the cold corridors, she found herself turning his words over and over in her mind. A mark, a price. It cares for guilt. She did not yet understand what any of it meant, but she understood, with a certainty that settled deep into her bones, that whatever had happened to put that scar on his chest, it had not been an ordinary battle wound at all. The following days settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. Each evening at the same hour, the same guard came to fetch her, and each evening she walked the same long corridor toward the black iron doors, her satchel packed with clean cloth and fresh salve, her mind already turning over the questions she planned to ask. Each night, Draven answered a little more than he had the night before, small pieces offered almost against his own will, as though her steady presence had begun to wear down some wall he had spent years building. She learned that the wound had first appeared the night his older brother died. She learned that no two people in the castle agreed on how that death had happened, and that anyone who asked too loudly about it tended to find reasons to leave court soon after. She learned that the physicians before her had not fled simply because the wound frightened them, but because Draven himself, in moments of unbearable pain, had said things in half-conscious mutters that no one wanted to have heard, words about blood and forgiveness, and a debt that could never be repaid. She did not yet know what those words meant. But she found, with each passing night, that she wanted to know less because the mystery intrigued her, and more because the man sitting silently under her hands, breathing carefully through pain he refused to name, had begun to matter to her in a way she had not expected, and was not entirely sure she was ready for. On the fifth night, as she finished her work and began packing away her tools, he spoke without being asked, his voice low and rough in the quiet of the chamber. "You have not asked me the question everyone else wants to ask," he said. She paused, glancing up at him. "Which question is that?" "Whether I killed him," he said. "My brother. Everyone wonders, no one asks. You have had 5 nights to ask it, and you have not." She considered her answer carefully before giving it, aware that whatever she said next would shape everything that came after. "I did not ask," she said slowly, "because I do not think the answer would tell me anything true about you. Guilt does not care whether a man's hands are clean. It only cares whether his heart believes they are dirty." Something shifted in his expression then, something she had not seen from him before. Not exhaustion, not danger, not the careful control he wore like armor every night she had known him. For just a moment he looked almost young, almost lost, like a man who had been carrying something enormous for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to set even a small piece of it down. "You are a strange healer, Mira," he said quietly. "I have been told that before," she said, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw the faintest ghost of something that might, in a kinder world, have been a smile. She left that night with her heart unsteady in a way it had never been before, aware that something between them had shifted, quiet and unspoken, in the space of a single careful conversation. She did not yet have a name for what she felt. She only knew that when the guard came the next evening to fetch her, she found herself walking a little faster down the cold stone corridor than she had the nights before, eager in a way that had nothing to do with duty at all. The rival healer arrived on the 7th day, though Mira did not learn of his presence until she was already halfway down the corridor toward the king's chamber and found her path blocked by a man she had never seen before. He was older than her, dressed in the fine dark robes of a court physician, with silver rings on his fingers and an expression that suggested he had already decided she was beneath his notice. "You must be the girl treating His Majesty," he said, his tone carrying just enough disdain to make the words feel like an insult dressed as a greeting. "I am Corwin, physician to the royal family for 11 years, before I was sent from this castle. I have returned at the council's request, to properly manage his condition. Your services are no longer required." Mira felt something cold settle in her stomach, though she kept her face carefully still. "Has the king asked for you?" she said. Corwin's mouth thinned. "The king does not need to ask. The council understands what is best for the kingdom, even when the king himself is too proud, or too broken, to admit he requires proper care, rather than the fumbling of a village healer." "I have not fumbled anything," Mira said, keeping her voice level despite the anger rising in her chest. "The wound has stayed closed longer under my care than it has in months, by his own admission." "A temporary reprieve," Corwin said dismissively. "I studied under the finest physicians in the capital. I know what that wound truly is, and I know it requires methods a healer of herbs and salves could never understand. Step aside, girl, this is beyond you." For a moment, standing in that cold corridor with Corwin's condescension pressing down on her, Mira felt the old doubt rise up, the quiet voice that told her she was nothing more than a village healer who had gotten lucky, who had stumbled into a role far greater than she was suited for. But she thought of Draven's golden eyes in the firelight, the way his breathing had steadied under her hands, the single word he had given her that first night, that no one else had ever managed to pull from him: guilt. Whatever Corwin knew about the wound's physical shape, she was certain now that he knew nothing at all about what truly caused it. "Then let the king decide," she said, and stepped past him toward the black iron doors before he could stop her. She heard him following close behind, his robes rustling with indignation, as the guard at the door pulled it open at the sound of her approach. Draven was already standing near the hearth, shirtless, the wound along his chest raw and freshly split from whatever strain the day had placed upon him. He looked up at the sound of the door, and his expression, which had been carefully guarded, shifted the moment he saw her. Then he saw Corwin behind her, and everything in his posture changed. "Corwin," he said, and his voice had gone flat and cold, in a way Mira had not heard before. "I did not summon you." "The council felt it necessary, Your Majesty," Corwin said, bowing low, though his eyes flicked toward Mira with open contempt. "This wound requires a physician's understanding, not the guesswork of an untrained girl playing at medicine." "She is not untrained," Draven said, and something in the way he said it, low and immediate, made Mira's chest tighten in a way she did not have time to examine. "She has done more for me in 7 nights than you managed in 11 years. Corwin's face reddened. "Your Majesty, with respect, you do not understand what you are inviting into your chamber. A village healer, treating a wound of this nature, without any understanding of its true cause, is not merely inadequate. It is dangerous. She could provoke something she does not comprehend." Draven's eyes narrowed. "And you understand its true cause?" "I understand enough," Corwin said carefully, "to know that it should not be spoken of, let alone treated by someone with no knowledge of what it truly is." For a long moment, no one spoke. The fire cracked in the hearth. Mira stood very still, watching the tension between the two men, aware that something important was happening that she did not yet fully understand. "Leave," Draven said finally, his voice quiet, but carrying an authority that filled the entire chamber. "You were not summoned. You are not needed. If the council wishes to discuss my care, they may discuss it with me directly, not send physicians to ambush my chamber uninvited." Corwin's jaw tightened, but he bowed again, stiffly, and turned to leave, though not before casting one final glance at Mira, a look that carried something close to a warning. "Be careful, girl," he said quietly, just before he stepped through the door. "You are playing with something far larger than you understand. When it breaks fully open, and it will, you will wish you had listened to those who tried to warn you away." Then he was gone, and the door closed heavily behind him, leaving Mira alone with Draven in the firelit quiet of the chamber. "What did he mean by that?" she asked. setting her satchel down near the hearth, though her eyes stayed fixed on Draven's face. Draven was quiet for a long moment, staring at the closed door as though Corwin's words still lingered in the air. "He knows part of the truth," he said finally. "Not all of it. No one outside this room knows all of it. But he knows enough to be afraid, and fear makes men like him dangerous." "Then tell me the rest," Mira said. "If I am to keep doing this, keep treating something that clearly frightens even trained physicians, I deserve to understand what I am truly facing." Draven turned to look at her then, and something in his gaze had changed since the night before, something rawer, more uncertain. "If I tell you," he said slowly, "there will be no taking it back. You will know something almost no one else in this kingdom knows, and once you know it, you cannot simply walk away and forget it." "I do not want to walk away," Mira said, surprising herself with how certain the words came out. "I want to understand." He studied her for a long moment, the firelight flickering across the ruined line of his scar, across the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. Then, slowly, he lowered himself onto the bench near the hearth and gestured for her to sit as well, though there was only one chair nearby, and she found herself kneeling instead, close enough that their knees nearly touched. "My brother's name was Hale," Draven said quietly, and the name seemed to cost him something to speak aloud. "He was older than me by 3 years. He was meant to be king. Everyone in this kingdom, everyone in this castle, expected him to take the crown, and rightly so. He was better suited for it than I ever was. Kinder, wiser, less prone to the anger that runs in our blood." Mira said nothing, simply listened, her hands folded in her lap, giving him the space to continue at whatever pace he needed. "6 years ago, there was an uprising in the eastern provinces," Draven continued. "Hale went to negotiate peace. I went with him, though I was meant only to guard him, nothing more. The negotiations turned violent. I do not remember all of what happened that night. I remember blood, I remember Hale's voice, and then I remember silence where his voice should have been." His hand came up, unconsciously, to rest against the scar on his chest, and Mira watched the small, involuntary motion with a tightness rising in her own throat. "When I woke, this wound was already here," he said. "It has never fully healed since. Some healers who came before you believed it was cursed, a mark left by whatever violence took my brother from me. Others believed it was simply guilt made physical, a wound my own mind refuses to let close because some part of me does not believe I deserve to be whole. I do not know which is true. I only know that it opens worse on nights when the guilt presses hardest, and it closes a little more on nights when, for reasons I do not fully understand, that weight feels lighter." He looked up at her then, his golden eyes searching hers with something that looked almost like fear, as though terrified of what he might see reflected back. "It has been lighter," he said quietly. "Every night since you arrived." Mira felt her breath catch in her chest, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the fire crackling softly beside them, the weight of his confession settling into the space between their bodies like something almost tangible. "I am glad," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did not know that was possible. I did not know a wound like this could respond to anything but salve and thread." "Neither did I," Draven said, "until you." She did not know what to say to that. She simply reached for her satchel, her hands trembling slightly now for the first time since she had begun treating him, and began the familiar, careful work of cleaning and dressing the wound, aware the entire time of his eyes on her face, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear at all. The castle grew restless as the full moon approached, and Mira noticed the change first in the servants, who spoke in hushed voices and avoided the upper halls after dark, and then in the guards, who doubled their numbers outside the king's chamber without being ordered to do so. "Why does everyone fear the full moon so greatly?" she asked Ellen, a kitchen maid who had become something close to a friend in the weeks since Mira's arrival, as the two of them prepared trays of food in the dim evening light of the kitchen. Elin glanced toward the door before answering, lowering her voice as though the walls themselves might carry her words upward to the king's ears. "They say the wound remembers the moon," Elin said, "that whatever happened the night his brother died, it happened under a full moon, and every month when it returns, the wound remembers too. Some of the older guards say his temper turns near unbearable on those nights. Others say he grows quiet instead, quieter than any other night of the month, like something inside him goes very still and very far away." Mira thought of Draven's careful control, the way his fingers pressed rhythmically into his knees when the pain grew worst, the way his breathing sometimes caught as though he were somewhere else entirely, reliving something none of them could see. "Has anyone ever asked him directly what happens?" Mira said. Ellen's eyes widened slightly. No one asks the king anything directly, Mira. Not about that night. Not ever. You are the only person in this castle who seems to have forgotten that rule. That evening, when the guard came to fetch her, his face carried a tension she had not seen in him before, and he did not meet her eyes as he led her down the corridor. Tonight will be different, he said quietly, just before they reached the black iron doors. The moon is full tonight. Whatever you see in there, I would ask that you not speak of it to anyone once you leave. She nodded, though her heart had begun to beat harder in her chest, and when the doors opened, she understood immediately why the guard had warned her. Draven was on his knees before the hearth, not standing, not sitting, but kneeling, as though something had driven him down to the stone floor and he had not yet found the strength to rise. The wound along his chest had split wide open, worse than she had ever seen it, blood running freely down over muscle that trembled with a violence she had not witnessed in any of their previous nights together. Draven, she said, rushing to his side without thinking, without the careful professional distance she had maintained until now. He did not respond right away. His eyes were open but unfocused, fixed on some point far beyond the walls of the chamber, and his lips moved with words too quiet for her to catch, a whisper repeated again and again like a prayer or a plea. Draven, she said again, kneeling in front of him, taking his face gently between her hands, forcing his gaze to meet hers. Look at me. Come back. Slowly, as though surfacing from very deep water, his eyes focused, found hers, and something in his expression cracked open entirely, raw and unguarded in a way she had never seen from him before. I hear him, he said, his voice breaking on the words. Every full moon, I hear him calling my name, the way he called it that night, right before the blade came down. I hear it, and I cannot make it stop, and I cannot go back and change what happened, and I cannot. His voice broke entirely, and for a long moment he simply knelt there, shaking, his hand pressed hard against the open wound as though trying to hold something inside himself that desperately wanted out. Mira did not reach for her satchel, not yet. Instead, she wrapped her arms around him, careful of the wound, holding him the way she might hold anyone drowning in grief too large for words, and felt him go rigid with surprise before, slowly, achingly, he allowed himself to lean into her instead of away. I was thrown back 5 years, he said quietly against her shoulder, his voice muffled and broken. Every time this happens. 5 years, back to that night, back to his voice, back to the moment I could not save him. You do not have to explain it all tonight, she said softly. I am not going anywhere. They stayed like that for a long while, the fire burning low beside them, his breathing slowly steadying against her shoulder, until finally he pulled back enough to look at her, his golden eyes red-rimmed and raw in a way that made something ache deep in her chest. No one has ever seen me like this, he said quietly. No one has ever been allowed to. I am glad you let me, she said. Something shifted in his expression then, something she had not expected, a flicker of anger that rose up so suddenly it startled her, though she understood immediately it was not directed at her. I hate this, he said, his voice hardening, his hands curling into fists at his sides. I hate that a wound can still control me after 6 years. I hate that I am still that same helpless boy on the battlefield every single month, unable to do anything but watch. The anger seemed to steady him in a strange way, giving him something to hold on to that was not grief, not helplessness, and Mira recognized it immediately for what it was, a familiar tool reached for instinctively, a sweet and steadying thing that let him climb back up out of the spiral before it swallowed him whole. Let it be angry, she said quietly. If it helps you stand, let it be angry. He looked at her with something like gratitude then, raw and unspoken, and slowly, with her help, he rose to his feet, steadier now, though the wound still bled freely down his chest. She worked quickly after that, cleaning and stitching with hands that had grown steady again despite everything she had just witnessed, and he sat still and quiet beneath her care, the anger settling into something calmer, more controlled, as the night wore on. When she finally finished, long past midnight, he caught her wrist gently before she could rise to leave, his grip warm and careful, nothing like the desperate grasping of moments before. Stay a while longer, he said quietly, just to sit, not to heal anything, just to sit. She stayed, and in the quiet hours before dawn, sitting beside him near the dying fire, neither of them spoke of the wound, or the brother, or the guilt that lived inside him like something with its own heartbeat. They spoke instead of small things, of the herbs she used to grow with her mother, of the village he remembered visiting once as a boy before the crown had ever weighed on his head, and for those few quiet hours, Mira thought, the ache in his chest seemed almost bearable, almost forgotten entirely. News of what had happened during the full moon should never have left that chamber, and yet within 3 days, whispers of it had reached every corner of the castle, twisted and reshaped with each retelling, until Mira barely recognized the story being passed from mouth to mouth in the kitchens and stables. She learned the truth of how it had spread on a gray afternoon, when Ellen pulled her aside in the herb store with a look of worry etched across her face. "Corwin has been speaking to the council," Ellen said quietly, glancing toward the door as though afraid of being overheard. "He says you have bewitched the king somehow, that no ordinary healer could bring him to such a state, kneeling and weeping like a broken man. He says it is dangerous, that you have some hold over him the council does not understand, and that you should be removed from the castle before you can do further harm." Mira felt her stomach drop. "That is not what happened. I helped him through something painful. That is all a healer does." "I know that," Ellen said gently. "But Corwin is clever, and he has the council's ear in ways you do not. He has convinced at least 2 of the elder councilors that your presence here is a risk to the kingdom's stability. They fear what it means for a king to show weakness in front of anyone, let alone a village healer with no family name to vouch for her character." That evening, when Mira was summoned not to the king's private chamber but to a smaller council room deeper in the castle, she understood immediately what was happening. 5 councilors sat at a long table, Corwin among them, his expression carefully composed into something that might have passed for concern if she had not already seen the contempt hiding beneath it. "We have called you here," said an older councilor with silver hair and cold eyes, "to discuss your continued presence in this castle. Reports have reached us of concerning behavior from His Majesty during your care. We must ask whether your methods are truly aiding his recovery, or worsening whatever affliction troubles him." "His condition has improved since I began treating him," Mira said, keeping her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "The wound has stayed closed longer than it has in months. Ask any guard who stands outside his door each morning." "Improved wounds mean little," Corwin cut in smoothly, "if the king himself is left emotionally unstable, weeping and vulnerable in ways unbecoming of a ruler. A king who shows such weakness invites danger from every corner of this kingdom. Enemies watch for cracks like these. Healer, you may be creating far more danger than you are curing." "Grief is not weakness," Mira said, her voice rising slightly despite her effort to control it. "And healing the body sometimes means allowing the heart room to break before it can mend. If any of you had spent even one night in that chamber, you would understand that." The room fell silent for a long moment, the councilors exchanging glances that Mira could not fully read. Then the doors at the far end of the room opened, and every head turned as Draven himself stepped inside, his expression thunderous in a way she had never seen directed at anyone but Corwin before. "Who summoned her here without my knowledge?" he said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to shrink every person seated at that table. The silver-haired councilor rose hastily. "Your Majesty, we merely sought to discuss concerns regarding my private affairs," Draven cut in coldly, "which are mine to manage, not this council's to interrogate through a healer who has done nothing but ease a burden none of you have ever had the courage to ask me about directly." His eyes swept the table, lingering longest on Corwin, whose composure had begun to crack visibly under the weight of that gaze. "If any of you have concerns about my fitness to rule," Draven said, "you may bring them to me directly, as men, rather than hiding behind whispers and physicians eager to reclaim positions they lost through their own failures. Corwin left this castle once already because he could not manage my care. He will not manipulate his way back into it by attacking the one person who has succeeded where he did not." Corwin's face had gone pale, but he said nothing, bowing his head stiffly instead, and one by one, the councilors murmured their apologies and excused themselves from the room until only Draven and Mira remained. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Draven crossed the room toward her, his expression softening into something far more vulnerable than the fury he had shown the council moments before. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "You should never have been dragged into this." "I do not regret it," Mira said. "Not the council, not the questions, none of it. Not if it means I get to keep helping you." He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing across his face, and then, slowly, he reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and careful around hers, as though afraid she might pull away. "You have given me something no council, no physician, no crown has ever given me," he said quietly. "Room to be something other than strong. Every single moment of my life. I do not know how to repay a gift like that." "You do not need to repay it," Mira said softly, aware of how close he now stood, aware of the warmth of his hand still holding hers. "I did not offer it as a debt." Something shifted in his golden eyes then, something that made her breath catch in her throat, and for a moment, she thought he might close the distance between them entirely. But he only lifted her hand gently, pressing the lightest, most careful kiss against her knuckles, before releasing it and stepping back, as though giving himself room to remember every reason why he should not want what he clearly did. "Come to the chamber tonight," he said quietly. "Not to heal anything, just to sit with me a while, the way we did after the moon." "I will be there," Mira said, and as she watched him leave the council room, she realized that whatever careful distance she had once maintained between healer and patient had long since disappeared entirely, replaced by something far more dangerous, far more real, and far more difficult to walk away from than any wound she had ever treated. That night, Mira arrived at the chamber to find it changed from the firelit, tense room she had grown accustomed to. Draven had asked for a small table to be brought in, set with simple food, bread and cheese and a jug of wine. And for a moment she stood in the doorway simply looking at it, unable to reconcile this quiet, almost ordinary scene with the powerful, wounded king she had come to know. "I thought," he said, a little uncertainly, gesturing toward the table, "that we might share a meal, rather than spend another evening with you kneeling over my wounds." "I would like that," she said, and meant it more than she expected to. They sat together near the fire, and for the first time since she had arrived in the castle, the conversation between them had nothing to do with wounds or guilt or the weight of the crown. He asked her about her childhood, and she found herself telling him about her mother, a healer herself, who had taught her everything she knew before a fever took her 3 winters ago. He listened with a quiet attentiveness that surprised her, asking questions in the right places, never rushing her past the parts that still ached to speak of. "She sounds like she was remarkable," he said softly, when she finished. "She was," Mira said. "I think she would have liked you, strange as that sounds. She always said the hardest patients to heal were the ones who had convinced themselves they did not deserve healing at all." Something flickered across his face at that, quick and complicated, but he did not look away from her. "She would have been right about me then," he said quietly. "Do you still believe that?" Mira asked. "That you do not deserve to heal?" He was quiet for a long moment, turning his cup slowly between his hands, watching the firelight catch in the wine. "I do not know anymore," he said finally. "For 6 years, I believed it completely. I believed the wound was fair, a debt owed for a mistake that cost my brother his life. But since you arrived, some nights I catch myself hoping it might close for good, and then I feel guilty for hoping at all, as though wanting to heal is its own kind of betrayal to his memory." "It is not betrayal," Mira said gently. "For my Razin, grief does not require you to stay broken forever, to prove you loved someone. Sometimes the truest way to honor someone is to become whole again, and carry them with you rather than carrying the wound instead." He looked at her then with an expression she had not seen from him before, something soft and searching, and almost afraid, as though her words had reached somewhere inside him no one had touched in a very long time. "How do you know such things?" he asked quietly. "I do not know them," she said. "I only believe them, because the alternative feels unbearable, and I have watched enough grief to know that unbearable things do not have to stay that way forever." They sat in comfortable silence for a while after that, and Mira found herself studying him in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the tired lines around his eyes that softened, ever so slightly, whenever he looked at her. She thought of Corwin's warning in the corridor, the council's suspicion, the danger that clearly surrounded whatever was growing between them, and found, to her own surprise, that she did not care nearly as much as she probably should. "Corwin will not stop," she said eventually, breaking the silence. "He has convinced himself of something about that wound, something he believes justifies removing me from this castle. I do not know what it is." Draven's expression darkened slightly at the mention of Corwin's name. "Corwin served this family for 11 years before I dismissed him. He believes he understands the wound because he was here the night my brother died. He was among the physicians who tried, and failed, to save him." Mira felt a chill move through her at that. "He was there? He has never forgiven himself for that failure," Draven said quietly. "I believe some part of him blames me for surviving when Hale did not, though he has never said it outright. His concern for the council is not truly concern for the kingdom. It is guilt of his own, wearing the mask of duty. Then he understands more than anyone what this wound truly is," Mira said slowly, pieces beginning to shift together in her mind. "Perhaps," Draven said, "or perhaps his guilt has curdled into something else entirely, something closer to resentment. I do not know which. I only know he is dangerous to underestimate, and I would rather you be cautious around him than trusting." Mira nodded slowly, filing the warning away, though she found her thoughts circling back again and again to the idea of Corwin standing in that room 6 years ago, watching Hale die, carrying his own private wound of guilt ever since. She wondered, not for the first time, whether the full truth of that night was still hiding somewhere neither she nor Draven had yet uncovered. But for now, in the firelight, with the king's hand resting close enough to hers that their fingers brushed each time either of them reached for their cup, she allowed herself simply to be present in the quiet warmth of the evening, aware that whatever complications waited beyond these walls, tonight belonged only to the two of them. Later, as she rose to leave, Draven caught her hand once more, gentler this time, less uncertain. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for staying, even when everything in this castle seems determined to send you away." "I am not so easily sent away," Mira said, and the small, tired smile that answered her from across the firelight stayed with her long after she had returned to her own quiet room, warm and unfamiliar against the cold weight of everything she still did not understand. Mira could not stop thinking about Corwin's presence on the night Hale died, and 3 days later, unable to let the question rest, she found herself slipping into the castle's old records room during the quiet hours of the afternoon, when most of the staff had gone to their midday meal. The room smelled of dust and old parchment, shelves lined with ledgers recording everything from grain shipments to physician reports stretching back decades. She was not entirely sure what she was searching for, only that some instinct told her the truth of that night had never been fully recorded, or if it had, someone had gone to great lengths to bury it. She found the physician's log from 6 years ago tucked near the back of a high shelf, its cover worn, and its pages slightly yellowed. Her hands trembled as she opened it, scanning quickly through entries until she found the date she was searching for. The entry was brief, far briefer than she expected for the death of a future king. It noted only that Prince Hale had died of wounds sustained during a violent uprising in the eastern provinces, and that Prince Draven had been found beside him, gravely injured himself, the source of his own wound unclear. The physician who had signed the entry was not Corwin. She frowned, flipping back further, searching for any mention of Corwin's presence that night at all, and found none. According to every record in that room, Corwin had not been present when Hale died. He had lied to her, or Draven had been mistaken, or something far stranger was happening than either of them yet understood. A sound behind her made her freeze, and she turned to find Corwin himself standing in the doorway, his expression cold and unreadable in the dim afternoon light. "You should not be in here," he said quietly. "Neither should the truth be hidden," Mira said, holding the ledger tighter, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. "You told the king you were present the night his brother died. This record says otherwise." Something shifted in Corwin's expression, a flicker of something that looked almost like fear before he mastered it back into careful composure. "Records can be incomplete," he said. "I was called in shortly after, to assist with the prince's wounds. Whether my name appears in that log or not changes nothing about what I witnessed." "Then tell me what you witnessed," Mira said, stepping closer despite the warning bells ringing loudly in her mind. "Tell me the truth about that night, or I will bring this ledger straight to the king, and let him decide for himself what to believe." Corwin's jaw tightened, and for a long moment she thought he might simply refuse and walk away. But something in her steady, unflinching gaze seemed to break something loose in him, some long-held weight he had carried in silence for far too many years. "It was not an uprising that killed him," Corwin said finally, his voice low and strained. "Not truly. There was a traitor among the guards sent to protect them, a man paid handsomely by a rival house to ensure Hale never returned to take the crown. Draven fought him. Draven very nearly died fighting him, but by the time reinforcements arrived, the traitor was dead, Hale was dying, and Draven was unconscious from his own wounds, unable to say what had truly happened." Mira felt the ledger grow heavy in her hands. Then why does Draven believe he failed to save him? Why does he carry guilt for a death that was never his fault? "Because I told him it was," Corwin said, and the words seemed to cost him everything to speak aloud. "I told him, when he woke and asked me what happened, that he had frozen, that his hesitation had cost his brother the seconds that might have saved him. It was not true. He fought bravely. He nearly died trying to protect Hale. But I was young and frightened, and I could not bear the thought of a broken kingdom discovering that a paid traitor had nearly succeeded in destroying the royal line. I needed a story simple enough for the court to accept without further investigation, one that would not implicate the rival house I suspected but could never prove. So I gave them a grieving young prince, consumed by guilt over his own failure, and the truth died quietly along with the traitor's body." Mira felt something cold and furious rise in her chest, You let him believe he killed his brother for 6 years to protect a lie? I did not intend for the wound to linger this long, Corwin said, his voice cracking slightly. I did not know grief and guilt could carve themselves so deeply into flesh, could return again and again the way his has. By the time I understood the cost of what I had done, the lie had already become truth in his mind, and I did not know how to take it back without destroying everything, including myself. You have to tell him, Mira said, now, tonight. If I tell him, Corwin said quietly, he will have every right to have me executed for what I have done. 6 years of silence, watching him suffer for a lie I created out of fear. I do not know if I have the courage to face that. You do not have a choice, Mira said, her voice hard and unwavering. He deserves the truth, whatever it costs you. He has been bleeding, both his body and his heart, for a crime that was never his. That ends tonight. Corwin stared at her for a long moment, something breaking visibly behind his eyes, and finally, slowly, he nodded. Tonight, he said quietly. I will tell him tonight. Mira left the records room with the ledger clutched tightly against her chest, her mind racing, her heart pounding with a mixture of fury and hope she had not expected to feel. Whatever happened when Corwin finally spoke the truth aloud, she understood now that everything was about to change, for Draven, for the wound that had haunted him for 6 long years, and for whatever fragile, unspoken thing had begun to grow between herself and the king who had led her closer than anyone else alive. Mira waited outside the chamber that evening longer than she ever had before, pacing the cold corridor while muffled voices rose and fell behind the black iron doors, too indistinct to make out words but unmistakably tense, rising at times into something close to shouting, before falling again into silence. When the doors finally opened, Corwin stumbled out looking as though he had aged a decade in the space of a single conversation, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. He did not meet her eyes as he passed, only murmured something too quiet to catch, before disappearing down the corridor, and Mira understood without needing to ask that the truth had finally been spoken aloud. She stepped into the chamber cautiously, unsure what she would find, and saw Draven standing near the hearth with his back to her, utterly still, his shoulders rigid with a tension that seemed to fill the entire room. Draven, she said softly. He did not turn immediately. When he finally did, his eyes were red-rimmed, his expression a storm of emotions she could not fully untangle, grief and fury, and something that looked almost like disbelief, all warring across his face at once. 6 years, he said, his voice rough and unsteady. 6 years I believed I had failed him. 6 years I let that belief carve itself into my chest every single month, and it was a lie told by a frightened man protecting his own reputation. I am so sorry, Mira said, crossing the room toward him. I am so sorry you carried something that was never yours to carry. I fought for him, Draven said, his voice cracking, the anger suddenly draining out of him, and leaving only raw, exposed grief in its place. I fought until I could not stand, and it still was not enough, and even that was not my fault. And I did not know, Mira, I did not know any of it. His legs seemed to give out beneath him then, and he sank onto the bench near the fire, his head in his hands, his whole body shaking with something that looked less like anger now and more like 6 years of grief, finally allowed to surface without the weight of misplaced blame crushing it down. Mira knelt in front of him without hesitation, pulling his hands gently away from his face, forcing him to look at her. You did not fail him, she said firmly. You never failed him. You fought for your brother with everything you had, and the only person who failed anyone that night was a traitor paid to destroy your family, and a frightened physician too afraid to tell the truth. None of that blood belongs to you. He stared at her for a long moment, something breaking open behind his eyes, and then, slowly, he reached up and pressed his palm against the scar on his own chest, as though testing whether the truth had already begun to change something beneath the skin. It does not hurt, he said quietly, sounding almost startled by the realization. For the first time in 6 years right now, it does not hurt at all. Mira felt tears rise unexpectedly in her own eyes at that, watching the raw disbelief and fragile hope moving across his face in equal measure. Perhaps it never truly needed the guilt to heal, she said softly. Perhaps it only needed the truth. He looked at her then with an expression she had never seen from him before, something open and unguarded and achingly tender, and slowly, carefully, he reached out and cupped her face in both his hands, his thumb brushing gently along her cheekbone. You did this, he said quietly. You pulled the truth out of a man who had buried it for 6 years. You gave me back something I did not even know I had lost. I only asked questions, Mira said. You did the rest, by being brave enough to hear the answers." For a long moment neither of them moved, the fire crackling softly beside them, his hands warm against her face, her heart pounding loud enough she was certain he could hear it. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward and pressed his lips gently against hers. It was soft and careful, and utterly unlike the powerful guarded king she had first met weeks ago in this very room. And when he pulled back just enough to search her eyes, she answered him not with words but by closing the distance between them again herself, letting the kiss deepen into something that spoke everything neither of them had yet found the courage to say aloud. When they finally parted, breathless, his forehead resting gently against hers, he let out a soft, disbelieving laugh, the first genuine sound of joy she had ever heard from him. "I do not know what to do with a heart that does not ache," he admitted quietly. "Then let me help you learn," Mira said softly, and felt him smile against her lips as he kissed her again. The peace did not last long. 3 nights after the truth had finally come to light, a messenger arrived at the castle gates just past midnight, half frozen and barely able to stand, carrying word that would shatter the fragile calm Mira and Draven had only just begun to build. "Riders," the messenger gasped, collapsing before the guards could catch him. "From the eastern provinces, armed, moving toward the castle under cover of darkness. They know, Your Majesty. Somehow they know the truth has come out." Draven was on his feet instantly, all traces of the softened, unguarded man from 3 nights before, replaced by the sharp, commanding presence of a king, preparing for war. Mira watched from the edge of the chamber as guards were summoned, orders shouted down corridors, the entire castle jolting awake around them like a creature startled from sleep. "The rival house," Draven said grimly, fastening a blade to his side with practiced, urgent hands. "They must have had someone inside these walls all along, watching, waiting to see if the truth of that night would ever surface. Now that it has, they cannot risk Corwin revealing their involvement to the council." "What will they do?" Mira asked, fear tightening cold fingers around her chest. "Silence anyone who knows," Draven said. "Corwin, possibly you. Certainly me if given the chance." Fear for him rose sharper and more immediate than any fear she had felt for herself, and she caught his arm before he could move past her toward the door. "Then let me help," she said. "I am not simply a healer waiting quietly in a corner while you ride into danger." He looked at her for a long moment, something torn and fierce moving behind his golden eyes, before he nodded once, sharply. "Stay near the healer's quarters," he said. "If this goes badly, wounded men will need you more than any blade will need another hand to hold it. Promise me you will stay safe." "I promise to be useful," Mira said, which was as close to a promise as she was willing to give, and something in his answering look told her he understood exactly what she meant. The attack came just before dawn, sudden and violent, riders breaching the outer gate before the full garrison could properly assemble. Mira heard the clash of steel and the shouts of guards from where she worked frantically in the healer's quarters, tearing cloth into strips, laying out every salve and needle she owned, in grim preparation for what she knew was coming. The first wounded man was carried in within the hour, and then another, and another, until the quiet room had transformed into something closer to the chaos of a battlefield, cries of pain mixing with her own urgent instructions as she worked without pause, stitching and binding wounds faster than she had ever worked in her life. It was near midday, when the fighting outside had finally begun to quiet, that Corwin himself was carried in, his robes soaked through with blood, his face ashen and pale. "He fought," gasped the guard carrying him, laying Corwin gently onto the nearest cot. When the riders broke through toward the king's chamber, he stood between them and the door, took a blade meant for his majesty. Mira's hands moved instantly to the wound in Corwin's side, pressing cloth hard against the bleeding, her mind racing through everything her mother had ever taught her about wounds this deep. "Why?" she said, working quickly. "Why would you do that, after everything?" Corwin's eyes found hers, glassy with pain, but strangely clear. 6 years of guilt," he said weakly. "I owed him more than a confession. I owed him a chance to live long enough to forgive me, if he ever could." She worked over him for what felt like hours, and when Draven finally appeared in the doorway, bloodied but alive, his eyes swept the room in frantic search before landing on her, relief crashing visibly over his features. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt beside Corwin's cot, watching Mira's hands move with steady, practiced urgency. "Will he live?" Draven asked quietly. "If the bleeding stops soon, yes," Mira said, not looking up from her work. Draven's hand found Corwin's, gripping it tightly despite everything, despite 6 years of a lie that had cost them both so much. You did not have to do that, Draven said, his voice rough. I did, Corwin whispered. I have owed you a life for 6 years, Your Majesty. Today I finally paid a piece of it back. By evening, the riders had been driven off or captured, the immediate threat contained, though Draven's guards reported grimly that the rival house behind the attack would need to be dealt with formally in the days ahead. But for now, in the exhausted, blood-streaked quiet of the healer's quarters, Corwin's breathing had steadied, his wound closed and dressed, his life, for the moment, secured. Draven found Mira afterward, alone at last in the corridor outside, her hands still faintly stained despite her best efforts to clean them, her whole body trembling now that the adrenaline of the day had finally begun to fade. You saved him, Draven said quietly, studying her with an expression of profound, exhausted gratitude. After everything he did to me, you saved his life without hesitation. That is what healing means, Mira said softly, even for those who do not always deserve it easily, especially for them perhaps. He reached for her then, pulling her gently against his chest, careful of her tired arms, and held her simply, silently, for a long moment in the quiet corridor, the danger of the day finally beginning to recede into something they could both, at last, breathe through. I almost lost you today, he murmured into her hair. I do not think I could carry that particular wound, if it ever came to that. You will not have to, Mira said, tightening her arms around him. I am not so easily lost, Draven, not from you. The months that followed brought a kind of peace the castle had not known in years. The rival house responsible for the attack was formally exposed before the full council, their claim to influence in the eastern provinces stripped away entirely, and the kingdom, slowly, began to settle into a steadiness it had lacked since the night Hale died 6 years before. Corwin recovered fully from his wound, though something in him remained forever changed by the ordeal, quieter, humbler, stripped of the cold arrogance he had once worn like armor. He remained in the castle at Draven's invitation, no longer as the king's personal physician, a role he insisted he no longer deserved, but as an advisor to the younger healers training in the castle's growing infirmary, a position that seemed, slowly, to be mending something in him just as surely as his body had mended from the blade. Mira found her own place in the castle shifting as well. She no longer treated Draven in secret, summoned quietly at odd hours through cold, empty corridors. She worked openly now in the infirmary alongside Corwin and the other healers, teaching what her mother had taught her, learning in turn from physicians trained in ways she had never encountered in her small village. The wound on Draven's chest, though it would always leave its mark, a pale, faded line rather than the raw, layered ruin it had once been, had not reopened once since the truth had finally come to light. On a quiet evening nearly a year after she had first walked into that firelit chamber, Mira found Draven standing alone on the high balcony overlooking the castle grounds, watching the sun set slowly over the eastern provinces that had once nearly cost him everything. She came to stand beside him without a word, and for a long while they simply watched the sky change color together, the easy silence between them a testament to everything they had built in the months since that first terrified summons had brought her to his door. "Do you remember," she said finally, "the first question I ever asked you?" He glanced at her, a smile tugging faintly at the corner of his mouth, softer now than the guarded, dangerous expression he had once worn like a shield against the entire world. "You asked if it still hurt," he said quietly. "And you fell silent," she said. For the longest time I had ever known anyone to stay silent. I did not know how to answer honestly, he admitted. I did not know then that pain could ever mean anything other than punishment. I did not know it could simply be a wound, healing the way any ordinary wound heals, without needing to carry a debt behind it. She turned to face him fully, reaching up to rest her palm gently against his chest, over the faded scar that still marked him, though so much lighter now than it had once been. "Does it still hurt?" she asked softly. The same question, spoken now with none of the fear that had once filled the room the first time she had asked it. Draven covered her hand with his own, holding it against his heart, his golden eyes warm in the fading evening light. "Not when you are here," he said quietly. "It has not hurt at all, not truly, since the night you refused to leave that chamber, even when everyone before you had run." Mira felt her eyes fill unexpectedly with tears, though they were nothing like the fear or grief that had haunted so many of their earlier nights together. These were softer, warmer, born of something that had finally, after so much darkness, been allowed to heal completely. "I am glad I stayed," she whispered. "So am I," Draven said, and drew her gently into his arms, holding her there against the backdrop of a kingdom finally at peace, a scar finally quiet, And a healer who had once feared nothing more than the silence behind a king's terrible wound, now standing beside him, without a trace of fear left in her heart at all. Below them, the castle settled into evening the way it always had, torches lit one by one along the high stone walls, guards changing posts in the courtyard, the ordinary rhythm of a kingdom that had nearly lost everything and found its way, slowly and painfully, back into the light. And on the high balcony above it all, the Alpha King, who had once been feared by every healer who ever crossed his threshold, stood instead simply as a man, whole and unafraid, holding the one person who had never once looked away from him, not even when the truth was at its most unbearable, not even when silence had been the only answer he had left to give.